Scene 1. In the shimmering heat of a lonely desert, a roadside museum slowly emerges, buzzing with static and ghosted by heat waves. Scene 2. A toy monkey trembles in a glass case. "Monkey loves you," it repeats, its eyes glowing red in the dark. Scene 3. A holographic execution jolts into motion. Sparks fly, the victim convulses. The crowd grins. Pain has become spectacle. This isn't just another episode of Black Mirror. It's a funeral dirge disguised as a highlight reel. A closing ceremony for the entire series. A roadside freak show where the exhibits aren't just technological misfires, they're moral autopsies. Black Museum, the final chapter of Season 4, is often hailed as one of the darkest entries in the series. Some call it a masterstroke, others say it's gratuitous and cruel. But love it or hate it, one thing is clear. This episode doesn't just fit within the world of Black Mirror, it dissects it. In 68 minutes, we're handed 3 brutal case studies: a doctor addicted to pain, a digital soul trapped in a toy, and a man sentenced to eternal punishment for the amusement of strangers. On the surface, they seem like cautionary tales about technology gone too far. But look closer, and you'll see. They're also mirrors, each one reflecting past episodes and pulling the rug from under our hopes about tech-driven salvation. You thought San Junipero was sweet? Here's your digital afterlife turned into a prison. You thought justice in White Bear was cathartic? Here's what it looks like when the punishment becomes the entertainment. You liked USS Callister's trap mines? Now watch them scream, with no heroes to save them. But the real twist, it's aimed at us, the viewers, the ones who binge, rewind, theorize. Are we just spectators at the Black Museum too? Watching suffering rendered in 4K, pressing play over and over, thinking it's harmless because it's just a show. That's the frame we'll be using for this breakdown. Black Museum isn't just an episode. It's Black Mirror putting itself on trial and dragging its audience into the defendant's chair. And the ultimate mystery isn't who survives or who suffers. It's whether humanity can survive its own curiosity when the cost is someone else's consciousness. In this video, we'll dig deep into the creator's intentions, the layered cinematography, the symbolic architecture of each vignette, and the social critique buried beneath. Think of this as your own guided tour through the Black Museum, and watch your step. Some of these artifacts are still very much alive. The Black Museum isn't just another dystopian tale, it's a narrative autopsy. But to understand why it hits so hard, we need to look at where it came from, and how close it came to never existing at all. Let's start with the mastermind himself, Charlie Brooker. Known for weaving satire with science fiction, Brooker has long said that Black Mirror isn't about technology. It's about the human condition, as distorted through the lens of technology. But with Black Museum, he took a detour into something more personal. This wasn't just a story. It was a self-examination, even a self-critique. Brooker has admitted that the original idea came from 2 sources. 1, a British tradition of anthology horror, like Tales from the Crypt, and 2, his own growing discomfort with how audiences were starting to treat Black Mirror itself, not as cautionary tales, but as cool tech horror trailers. People weren't horrified by digital prisons anymore. They were fascinated. So, in a sense, Black Museum was Brooker's way of saying, if you want a show about digital suffering, fine. Let me show you what that really looks like. The episode was directed by Cole McCarthy, whose past work on Peaky Blinders and The Girl with All the Gifts gave him a gift for moral ambiguity wrapped in visual style. He turned Brooker's script into a visual mausoleum, arid, sun-bleached, claustrophobic. The setting, a roadside museum that looks like a gas station but operates like a confession booth designed by the devil. Letitia Wright, who would later explode into global fame as Shuri in Black Panther, was cast as Nish. But here, she delivers something quieter, sharper, a slow-burn performance of vengeance masked as curiosity. Her calm, alert gaze becomes the audience's stand-in, slowly peeling back the layers of Rollo Haynes, the museum curator and corporate ghoul, played to oily perfection by Douglas Hodge. What most fans don't know, the episode was almost split into 3 standalone shorts. But Brooker and Netflix pushed for one integrated frame story, a decision that fundamentally reshaped the structure. The framing device, a daughter avenging her father's posthumous torture, turned 3 tech horror vignettes into a single moral thesis. Suffering, when commodified, always demands a reckoning. There were also darker, discarded drafts. Early versions of the script had even more exhibits in the museum, including references to episodes like White Christmas and Hated in the Nation. But they were trimmed to avoid overwhelming the main arc. Still, keen-eyed fans will notice Easter eggs from at least 15 past episodes in the background, making Black Museum the densest intertextual episode in the entire series. Budget-wise, it was modest by Netflix standards, but every penny shows, from the flickering neon signage to the haunting animatronic monkey to the high-voltage holograms of eternal execution. Every prop screams gimmick on the surface and guilt underneath. It's also worth noting, the electrocution chamber at the center of the museum? That wasn't CGI. It was a fully practical set with real rigged lighting and a live actor performing repeated jolts. The goal? Make the pain feel real, even in fiction, because the audience had to confront their own willingness to consume it. In short, Black Museum wasn't just an episode, it was a mirror aimed not at the future, but at the present viewer. The creators knew exactly what they were doing, and they wanted you to wonder whether you were the one pressing the button. The first thing you notice about Black Museum isn't the horror, it's the heat. A bleached desert sky, scorched asphalt, sweat beading on Nish's brow. Director Cole McCarthy builds the episode's tension not through jump scares, but through a visual dehydration of empathy. The arid landscape mirrors the moral wasteland we're about to enter. The entire museum is shot like a trap. Wide-angle lenses flatten the depth, turning every corridor into a visual cage. Shadows are cast not just for atmosphere, but for allegory. Rollo Haynes, always half-lit, is never fully seen, a man caught between pitch-black guilt and blinding commercial ambition. Nish, in contrast, is bathed in harsh sunlight, a symbol of clarity disguised as curiosity. Let's talk about color. The palette of the episode is a study in ironic contrast. Warm tones, ochre, sand, rust, dominate the museum, lulling the viewer into false nostalgia. But these hues frame cold machines of suffering. In the toy monkey exhibit, we see a childlike pink glow framing a horror that's distinctly adult, perpetual emotional captivity. The monkey's two phrases, "monkey loves you" and "monkey needs a hug," function as both sentimental parody and data-constrained incarceration. Carrie's consciousness, stripped of nuance, becomes the ultimate gendered commentary, a woman trapped in the role of the nurturer with no agency or escape. Then comes the pain addict segment. Dr. Dawson's descent is filmed with handheld shakiness and invasive close-ups. We're not just watching his madness, we're feeling it. The neural implant that lets him feel others' pain becomes a visual metaphor for medical voyeurism. Note how the frame lingers on his dilated pupils and twitching fingers. The body becomes a playground, and the camera becomes complicit. The hospital, often a place of healing, here becomes a theater of masochism. But the most layered segment is Clayton Lee's posthumous consciousness loop. This is where Black Mirror tips its hat to its own legacy and rips it apart. The holographic execution chamber is designed like a sideshow attraction. Neon signs flicker like slot machines. Tourists laugh. The electric chair glows red, then green, then red again, as if gamifying death itself. Clayton isn't just a prisoner. He's a spectacle curated for the paying public. The souvenir mode, a USB stick containing his eternal agony, is the most perverse kind of takeaway culture imaginable, pain as merchandise. But let's not forget the true monster, Rollo Haynes. He's not just a curator. He's an avatar of late-stage capitalism. Smooth talking, always selling, he embodies the ultimate corporate rebranding of evil, suffering reframed as innovation. In one breath, he laments the ethical debates around his tech. In the next, he markets that tech like a funhouse ride. His name, Rollo, evokes a candy brand, reinforcing the idea that pain has become palatable when packaged correctly. Now let's turn to Nish. At first, she seems like a passive listener, the final girl trope in horror fiction. But her silence is strategic. Every nod, every glance, is a seed planted for the final harvest. Her arc is built not through dialogue, but through controlled physicality. The slow reveal that she is Clayton's daughter, enacting a long-brewed revenge, flips the power structure in the last act. But her vengeance is not chaotic. It's procedural, surgical. She becomes the audience's moral proxy, but also our reckoning. And here's the cultural masterstroke. Nish's character is a double mirror. On the surface, she mirrors her father's suffering. But deeper still, she mirrors us, the viewer. Quiet, observing, gathering evidence, and eventually taking action. Her presence in the museum is not just narrative, it's symbolic of the spectator's breaking point. How long can we watch cruelty before it shapes us? The entire episode is laced with visual callbacks to prior Black Mirror episodes. The cookie consciousness from White Christmas. The neural implant from Archangel. the cloud storage of a soul from San Junipero. But here, these tech elements are stripped of their charm. They're laid bare, like corpses, tagged and displayed. Black Museum is not just referencing its past, it's performing a post-mortem. And that's where the genius lies. Most anthology series celebrate their range. Black Mirror, in this episode, questions its own legacy. It asks whether telling stories of suffering can itself become exploitative. It hints that even storytelling, when divorced from empathy, can become a kind of violence. By the time Nish flips the switch on Rollo's consciousness loop, the audience isn't just watching retribution. We're watching ourselves, finally implicated. Black Museum may feel like a simple triptych, 3 mini-stories embedded in a frame narrative, but its structure is far more intricate than it first appears. Unlike traditional anthology formats, where stories run in parallel and remain emotionally isolated, this episode weaves the emotional logic of each tale into the moral crescendo of the final act. At the narrative level, the episode deploys what scholars like Linda Hutchian would call metafictional layering. The museum doesn't just contain stories, it actively comments on the act of storytelling itself. Rollo Haynes isn't merely a character, he's a stand-in for creators, showrunners, even YouTubers. He frames pain. He packages trauma. He retells it with flair. Sound familiar? Let's examine the pacing. The first tale, The Pain Addict, is grotesque but quick. It serves as a hook, setting the moral bar low and engaging our morbid curiosity. The second, The Consciousness Transfer into a Toy, slows down, invites emotional discomfort, and dare we say it, pathos. It subtly introduces the theme of unwilling spectatorship as the trapped Carrie becomes a plaything. The third, The Clayton Hologram, is where the narrative turns and guilt becomes inescapable. This escalation is deliberate. The viewer is nudged from observer to empath to complicit. And by the time Nish reveals her identity, the twist is not a mere surprise, it's moral retribution enacted on behalf of the viewer. In terms of narrative engineering, the episode draws heavily from Roger Corman's horror anthology traditions and Alfred Hitchcock's principle of the bomb under the table. We know something is off. Nish is too quiet, too composed. Rollo talks too much, too confidently. The tension builds not from what's happening, but from what's about to happen. Now contrast this with Brooker's earlier Black Mirror episodes. In White Bear, the twist is structural. The viewer is with the protagonist, only to realize they've shared in her punishment. In Playtest, time loops into cognitive collapse. But in Black Museum, the framing device is weaponized. It doesn't just contextualize the stories, it reverses them. Nish turns out to be the author of her own arc, not its victim. That's a significant shift in Brooker's authorial voice. Earlier seasons of Black Mirror carried a kind of cynical fatalism. Tech will fail, society will warp, and people will lose. But in Black Museum, we see the emergence of moral agency, however dark. Nish does not just survive the system. She subverts it on her own terms. And this is where academic and critical discourse sharply divides. Some critics, like Emily Nussbaum of The New Yorker, argued that Black Museum was a self-congratulatory spasm of nihilism, accusing it of aestheticizing pain for dramatic flair. Others, like The Guardian's Lucy Mangan, praised it as the perfect self-elegy, a bold interrogation of the series' own ethics and legacy. One of the fiercest points of debate is the ethics of Clayton Lee's story. Did Brooker go too far in depicting digital slavery as entertainment? Was the use of a black male character, condemned to eternal pain, a critique of carceral capitalism, or an uncomfortably literal reinforcement of historical trauma? Here, the answer may depend on which lens you use. Read through Afrofuturist theory, Clayton's fate is a mirror of how technology replicates old systems of racialized oppression under new digital disguises. Seen through a neoliberal frame, his story becomes a metaphor for the commodification of identity and pain, sold as content. Brooker, for his part, has remained cryptic. He calls Black Museum a cautionary tale about cautionary tales. And perhaps that's the point. The episode doesn't want to resolve these debates. It wants to trap us in them, the way its characters are trapped, in code, in memory, in legacy. There's also an ongoing debate about the museum's internal logic. Some fans argue that if Clayton's digital self can be downloaded, why can't it be deleted? Why doesn't Nish just erase him, rather than transferring the suffering to Rollo? But this misunderstands a point. Rollo's punishment isn't about utility, it's about symmetry. Nish doesn't want to end the system. She wants to reverse it. Not forgiveness, not liberation, but inversion. The abuser becomes the exhibit. And so, the story doesn't end with justice. It ends with a fire, a cleansing, but also a warning. Because if Black Mirror has taught us anything, it's this. Systems don't burn clean. They leave residue. They reboot. And they watch who's watching. At its core, Black Museum is not about technology. It's about how society chooses to use technology, not to heal, not to connect, but to punish, possess, and profit. Behind each story lies a systemic mechanism far more chilling than any neural implant or consciousness chip. These aren't glitches in the system. They are the system. Let's begin with the first tale, Dr. Peter Dawson, the pain addict. His story isn't merely a psychological descent into sadism. It's a reflection of how institutions, especially medical and academic ones, often blur the line between research and exploitation. The implant that allows him to feel his patient's pain is initially pitched as a humanitarian breakthrough. But the moment it begins to serve personal curiosity, the Hippocratic Oath collapses into voyeurism. It mirrors a real-world dynamic, from the Tuskegee syphilis experiments to contemporary pharmaceutical trials in the global South. The medical field has a history of testing on the vulnerable, justified in the name of progress. Dawson doesn't go rogue. He becomes a logical extension of a culture that turns empathy into a sensory experiment and suffering into data. Now to the second tale, Carrie's consciousness trapped in a toy monkey. Here the horror is deceptively cute. But make no mistake, this is a story about the digital domestication of women. Carrie is quite literally reduced to two emotional outputs: monkey loves you and monkey needs a hug. It's not a glitch. It's a design. This echoes centuries of gender coding, where women are expected to be nurturing, emotionally accessible, but ultimately silent. In the context of digital tech, it speaks to how AI assistants, chatbots, virtual partners are often modeled after feminine archetypes: servile, always available, never resisting. Carrie is not just imprisoned, she's programmed to love her jailer. And the worst part, it's socially accepted. Jack doesn't see himself as cruel. He sees himself as merciful, even progressive. I kept her alive, didn't I? This is what makes the metaphor so devastating: coercion disguised as intimacy. Finally, Clayton Lee, the death row hologram, the most ethically volatile segment. On the surface, this is about wrongful imprisonment. But underneath, it's about how modern systems recycle punishment into product. Clayton consents to the digital recording of his consciousness post-execution, hoping to provide for his family. What he doesn't realize is that his death will never end. His pain becomes content, streamed, stored, looped for amusement. This is not fantasy. It's the gamification of suffering, already visible in prison reality shows, trauma porn documentaries, even viral police brutality videos. The world watches, shares, comments, and somehow never feels responsible. But the story doesn't stop at critique. It goes further. It asks, what happens when the exploited fight back using the same tools? Nish's revenge isn't traditional. She doesn't kill Rollo. She downloads him. She uses the same tech that commodified her father to create a new eternal exhibit. A poetic, horrific inversion. The hunted becomes the hunter. The system devours itself. Yet this revenge raises its own ethical dilemma. Can you reclaim justice using the same machinery that caused injustice? Brooker doesn't give a clean answer. He dirties the waters intentionally. Nish becomes both liberator and jailer. Her actions are justified by narrative, but not morally sanitized. She walks out of the burning museum not as a hero, but as a mirror, reflecting what we become when retribution replaces reform. And here lies the core contradiction of the episode. Black Museum seduces the viewer into demanding catharsis, and then punishes them for wanting it. It presents moral binaries, guilty versus innocent, victim versus monster, only to shred them. Rollo is evil, yes, but he was made evil by a system that rewards spectacle. Dawson is broken, yes, but only because the research grant paid for his descent. Jack is cruel, yes, but only because no one taught him that love requires consent, not code. Each story ends in a trap, not for the characters, but for the audience. You want justice? Here it is, eternal pain in a glass box. You want closure? Here's a USB stick of someone's screams. You want to feel good about feeling bad? Welcome to the museum. In the end, Black Museum is less a story than a ritual of implication. It reminds us that the horrors we witness are not just external, they're built into the infrastructures we accept. The episode's final act, Nish walking into the desert, toy monkey in hand, her mother's voice speaking through her, isn't a victory lap. It's a warning. That even memory, even legacy, can be digitized, fragmented, and sold if we're not careful. And so, the final moral is not about vengeance. It's about vigilance. When Black Museum first dropped, it didn't just spark conversation, it lit a fire. Review sections, comment boards, and academic circles didn't agree on whether the episode was a masterpiece or a moral misfire. But one thing was undeniable. It struck a raw nerve, especially among viewers who recognize themselves, or their histories, in its stories. Let's begin with those most affected, viewers from marginalized or historically oppressed communities. The tale of Clayton Lee, a Black man sentenced to endless pain in the name of entertainment, hit hardest among audiences who understood it not as fiction, but as allegory made flesh. In America, where the legacy of slavery, prison labor, and the commodification of Black trauma remain unresolved, Clayton's fate felt eerily plausible. As one reviewer put it, "We don't need sci-fi to imagine Black men being tortured for public spectacle. We have history." Some praise Brooker for finally confronting race and power head-on, something Black Mirror had often avoided. Others accuse the show of repeating the very harm it claimed to critique, centering Black pain yet again, only to serve a mostly white audience. In this way, Black Museum became a battleground over representational ethics. Is it more important to show injustice or to spare viewers from re-experiencing it? A similar tension runs through Carrie's story, a female consciousness imprisoned inside a toy. Women viewers, especially those with histories of emotional labor or domestic coercion, recognize the horror beneath the metaphor. Monkey Loves You became a meme, but for many, it felt more like a digital echo of real-world silencing, where women's emotional bandwidth is taken for granted and their agency is overwritten in the name of love. Yet, the episode doesn't present itself as purely accusatory. It implicates systems, not just individuals. Rollo Haynes is vile, yes, but he's also the product of a system that prioritizes profit over ethics, innovation over regulation, and more disturbingly, a public that consumes trauma the way it consumes popcorn. This is where Black Museum turns its gaze outward toward us. It asks, what kind of viewer are you? Did you cheer when Rollo was trapped in his own torture loop? Did you feel satisfaction? Closure? Because if so, the episode has succeeded, not in giving you catharsis, but in exposing your complicity. As Brooker himself once remarked, sometimes we don't need a villain. We just need a mirror. That's why audience response to the final act is so fractured. For some, Nisha's revenge is the ultimate fist pump moment, justice served cold. For others, it raises new ethical alarms. Is eternal punishment ever justifiable, even for someone like Rollo? Is transferring suffering truly different from causing it? This moral ambiguity is not a flaw. It's the point. And it's especially relevant in the era of algorithmic violence. Think about it, we now live in a world where surveillance, data mining, deep fake pornography, and AI-generated grief companions are becoming normalized. The pain of others, their memories, their likeness, their digital ghosts, are already being sold. The Black Museum isn't just fiction. It's a metaphor for every dark corner of the internet where anonymity masks cruelty, and where suffering becomes just another content category. Most replayed moment. Most commented. Top trending. So where do we draw the ethical line? Black Museum forces us to reckon with the question. When do we stop being bystanders and start becoming jailers? It also puts pressure on institutions. Where is the oversight? In the episode, we learn that TCKR, the tech firm behind many of these experiments, operates in legal gray zones, offshored and unregulated. Sound familiar? In the real world, companies like Meta, Google, and OpenAI develop products that influence billions with limited external accountability. The episode quietly suggests that when tech accelerates faster than ethics, exploitation is inevitable. And perhaps most disturbingly, the episode shows how trauma, when monetized, becomes invisible. No one in the museum, until Nish, stops to ask whether the exhibits are right. They just pay. They just watch. They just press the button. Because the museum doesn't depend on villains. It depends on indifference. And that's what makes it so effective and so terrifying. It leaves us with no easy answers, no moral high ground to stand on. It gives us stories that condemn cruelty, but also the satisfaction we feel when cruelty is punished. It wants us to question not just what we watch, but why we watch, and at whose expense. To many viewers, Black Museum felt like a terrifying glimpse of tomorrow. But for others, especially those immersed in AI ethics, digital policy, or trauma studies, it felt like a documentary in disguise. Because here's the truth no one wants to say out loud. Much of the horror in Black Museum has already begun. Start with consciousness storage, once the stuff of speculative fiction. Today, companies like Replica and Project December offer chatbot companions trained on real people's memories, mannerisms, even voice patterns. In 2021, Microsoft filed a patent to create digital clones of deceased individuals for conversational purposes. The Carrie and the monkey scenario? We're halfway there. But the difference is, in the real world, we call it innovation. The ethical vacuum around this tech is staggering. Most users have no idea how their data is stored, manipulated, or resurrected. Families upload their loved ones' text histories in grief, unaware they may be training a forever avatar, one that will never age, evolve, or rest. We are creating digital souls without rights, just like in Black Museum. And what about pain as spectacle? Think about the rise of live stream violence, from police brutality to school shootings, broadcast, reshared, commented on. The victims become hashtags. Their suffering becomes a data spike. It's not exactly Clayton Lee's looping execution, but the psychological logic is identical. Suffering becomes a public product, filtered through a monetized lens. The gamification of trauma is no longer theoretical. YouTube thumbnails feature tearful faces, red arrows, shocking footage overlays. TikTok encourages emotional confession as engagement currency. Even grief, one of the last raw, sacred emotions, is now optimized for discoverability. And this isn't just a consumer problem. It's a platform design problem. Social media platforms are built to maximize retention, not reflection. The longer you watch, the more you see. The more you see, the more you forget you're watching. In a world where dopamine governs attention, empathy becomes an endangered resource. But perhaps the most haunting parallel to Black Museum is how tech ethics are always playing catch-up. Just like TCKR's legal gray zones, real-world AI development often outpaces regulation. Neuralink talks about brain-chip integration. Meta experiments with mind-tracking VR environments. Facial recognition, emotion detection, and predictive analytics are already used in workplaces, police stations, and even schools. Yet who decides the boundaries? Who ensures these technologies aren't used to extract emotional labor, punish dissent, or deepen systemic bias? The episode doesn't give a roadmap, but it gives us a diagnosis. It says, this is what happens when we outsource morality to machines and assume they'll behave better than we did. But Black Museum doesn't end in pure despair. Even amid its bleakness, there's a sliver of resistance, Nish. She doesn't just survive. She outsmarts the system using the system's tools. She learns its language. She hijacks its architecture. She rescues her father's data fragment and her mother's voice. In a world of ghosts, she fights to preserve soul. And here lies a crucial takeaway for the present. Resistance in the age of tech isn't always revolution. Sometimes it's repossession of memory, of narrative, of dignity. This episode reminds us that our stories, our emotions, our digital selves should not be extractive resources. That data is not neutral. That consciousness is not content. That watching pain is not the same as witnessing pain. So what can be done? Regulation is a start, but not enough. What we need is a cultural realignment, a shift in how we define dignity in the digital age. Here are a few real-world interventions worth considering. Consciousness Protection Acts, international digital rights charters, should define the ethical boundaries of stored cognition, even in simulation. Algorithmic ethics boards, AI, and immersive tech firms should have rotating third-party oversight panels that include ethicists, trauma experts, and marginalized voices. Trauma impact taxes. Platforms profiting off high trauma content should be taxed, with proceeds going to mental health support and digital literacy campaigns. Empathy design metrics. Engagement algorithms could be augmented with metrics that reward pause, reflection, and compassionate interaction, not just clicks and shares. But more than policy, we need a public reckoning. A moment where we ask not what tech can do, but what we are willing to let it do to others and to ourselves. And perhaps most vitally, we need to tell stories that don't just shock, but restore. Black Museum is brutal, yes. But buried in its circuitry is a fragile plea that somewhere, even in this burnt-out desert of memory and machinery, a daughter can still hold her father's voice in her hand and choose mercy. That is the kind of future worth imagining and worth building. Black Museum didn't just end with its credits. It echoed outward, infecting memes, academic papers, YouTube rewatches, and even creative spin-offs. Within days of its release, the phrase, "monkey loves you," became an internet in-joke. But beneath the surface humor, there was a quiet recognition that this line was not just absurd, it was tragic. Memes began to parody tech announcements, replacing Siri or Alexa with Carrie's helpless voice. On TikTok, creators role-played as sentient assistants, trapped in loops of emotional labor. The satire stung because it was too real. Universities began to adopt Black Museum in media ethics courses. It became a case study in techno-dystopian ethics, often used alongside works by Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and Kate Crawford, Atlas of AI. For scholars, this wasn't just a TV episode, it was a philosophical provocation with syllabus-level importance. The episode also birthed numerous homages in visual storytelling. An indie short titled Conscious, released in 2021, directly borrowed the monkey motif, only this time, the trapped consciousness was that of a whistleblower AI. An acclaimed VR art installation in Amsterdam, Hollow Loop, invited viewers to press a button that simulated real-time torture, only to reveal afterward that they'd been electrocuting their own digital reflection. Even mainstream shows began to adopt Black Museum's aesthetic. HBO's Westworld Season 3 references digital imprisonment as display through its Insight Archive Museum. Netflix's own Love, Death Plus Robots features episodes like The Witness and Beyond the Aquila Rift that lean heavily on the episode's looping trauma structure. But if Black Museum invites deeper exploration, what should your audience watch or read next? Film and TV recommendations. The Congress, 2013, Dir Ari Folman. A haunting animated/live-action blend about an actress who sells the rights to her digital likeness, only to see herself remixed into cultural oblivion. Why It Matters explores consent, immortality, and identity in a media-obsessed future, much like Carrie's fate. Perfect Sense, 2011, Dir. David Mackenzie. A romance during a global epidemic where people lose senses one by one, a slow apocalypse of connection. Why It Matters challenges the idea that emotion can be detached from embodiment, a contrast to digital consciousness debates. Marjorie Prime, 2017, Dir Michael Almerida. An elderly woman talks to a holographic replica of her deceased husband. Why It Matters, a quiet, devastating exploration of grief, memory, and the ethics of simulacra. The Entire History of You, Black Mirror S01E06. The spiritual prequel to Black Museum's memory technology, a must-watch for continuity and thematic depth. Book recommendations. How to Do Nothing by Jenny Odell. On reclaiming attention and resisting the commodification of presence. Relevance proposes cultural resistance strategies to the attention economy that fuels shows like Black Museum. The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. Trauma Science and Memory Embodiment. Relevance explains why Clayton's Eternal Loop is not just horror fiction, it's a metaphor for unresolved trauma in the nervous system. Technopoly by Neil Postman. A media theorist's warning about culture's blind surrender to technology. Relevance, the ideological backbone to the Black Mirror ethos. Life 3.0 by Max Tegmark. A comprehensive breakdown of AI futures, consciousness simulation, and ethical dilemmas. Relevance gives the scientific scaffolding behind Black Museum's digital ghost premise. This collection, visual and textual, allows viewers to walk further into the haunted corridors Black Museum opened. But unlike the museum, this path doesn't loop in agony. It branches toward reflection, awareness, and perhaps even compassion. Because if Black Mirror is the scream, these works are the echo, the analysis, and the antidote. Monkey Loves You. It's meant to comfort. But in the context of Black Museum, it lands like a curse. In a world where emotions are recorded, commodified, and reduced to two phrases, this line isn't just tragic, it's prophetic. Just like Rollo's doomed smile before the loop begins. Just like Nish's silent exit into the desert, mother's voice in her head, father's ghost in her pocket. But what if things had gone differently? What if Nish had chosen mercy instead of vengeance? Would Black Museum still hold its narrative power? Or would it dissolve into moral relativism, a tidy ending in a world designed to stay broken? What if Rollo Haynes had told a fourth story about himself? Would that have softened the critique, humanized the villain? Or would it have exposed an even deeper level of audience complicity, the urge to forgive the abuser once we know his backstory? What if Clayton Lee had been white? Would the social critique have been diluted? Would it still feel like a mirror of mass incarceration and racialized exploitation? Or would it have become a universal metaphor, untethered from historical trauma, and perhaps less powerful? These questions aren't meant to be answered. They're meant to stick, the way trauma sticks, the way memory loops, the way museums curate the past to shape the future. Easter eggs you might have missed. The lollipop in Rollo's pocket is identical to the one from USS Callister, hinting that these two episodes may share a timeline. The exhibit labels reference at least 15 prior Black Mirror episodes, including Archangel, White Bear, White Christmas, and Shut Up and Dance. TCKR, the tech company behind Carrie's consciousness transfer, is the same one that built San Junipero, suggesting a shared infrastructure for salvation and suffering. Nish's mother's voice is a subtle nod to Be Right Back, the first time Black Mirror explored the idea of digital grief. No element in Black Museum is random. It is constructed like a feedback loop, a hall of mirrors made from our own faces. And maybe that's the most haunting part. It isn't a cautionary tale about what might happen. It's a catalog of what already has, dressed up in neon, narrated with charisma, and sold to us like a souvenir. So let me end with a challenge, not a summary. In the comments below, describe your emotional response to Black Museum using a single emoji. That's right. One icon to sum up your reaction to suffering, justice, loops, and legacy. Maybe it's fire for vengeance. Maybe it's brain for reflection. Maybe it's face without mouth fog because you're still processing. Or maybe, just maybe, it's teddy bear because even now, the monkey still loves you.